Hello and welcome to another Hasselblad webinar. I hope you're all good today, and we've got the subject today of colour management, Hasselblad's natural colour solution and the technology that we use for our colour profiling. So the main presenter today is me, Mark Whitney. I'm the European Events Manager, and I'm joined by my colleague Chris Coos, who's our Global Technical Communications Manager, and he'll take us through the presentation proper in just a few moments. Just before we move on, Hasselblad have got some news today. Today we've announced the new X1D2 and 907X Special Edition firmware update. So go to the Hasselblad website to be able to download that and apply it to your camera. We've got a special webinar for the features included in the new update on Tuesday, the 9th of June, 3 o'clock British Summer Time. So please join into that and register on the Hasselblad website to find out more about this update. So moving on for today. So today's webinar is aimed at photographers, creative image creators who would like to know more about Hasselblad's colour profiling technology, HNCS for short. The level is going to be sort of from beginner to advanced. The way that the presentation is structured, it will build up from a sort of a basics, which will then enable us to move on to some of the more advanced topics of it further on. So hopefully you can follow us all the way through. And it's the benefit really is to understand what all this technology does in the real world scenarios for all image creators. And if you do want to find out more about it after the webinar, there's a link there on our website that's got a page with a bit more information that you can print off. So the agenda, just quickly, the benefits of managing the color, how we can control it, how the color conversion works, benefits of medium format systems, the benefits of higher bit depth and dynamic range, Hasselblad system benefits, HNCS and how it works, and then how to extract the most from your raw file, which includes the focus work file. So we estimate the running time to be about 45 minutes, give or take, and hopefully that will allow us a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A. And then just before we pass over to Chris, I just wanted to advertise the webinar that we've got next week. It's a virtual medium format meetup with an artist talk with Chris Gunn. It was going to be hosted by my colleagues in the US, and that's scheduled for Thursday, the 11th of June at 3 o'clock Eastern District Time. So slightly different time zone there, but yeah, next Thursday at 11 o'clock, and you can register on our website. So if I can now pass you over to Chris. How you doing, Chris?
Hi, Mark, thanks. Hopefully you can see me now, and I'll just share the screen.
Yeah, I'll just transfer the power to you.
Thank you. So hopefully now everybody can see the color management slide. So hi everyone. As we work through, I'll try and take it step by step, go in as much detail as I dare, but we do have a time constraint. So making a little start. Here we go. So what's the benefits of managing color? So while we're out and about and we get to a position where we want to take an image, we will have the hope that once we use our camera and we capture that image onto our SD card, once we actually then process that file, the image on the display, and should we print it, the printed image, we hope all will match wonderfully. Now, obviously, sometimes that happens. Other times we have issues if we've covered or captured a much wider range of colors than a particular device can output. Or, we've all been to a TV showroom and you look along and screens show a different color. Literally pick a color, any color. So there are issues that crop up. printed media, obviously if we don't use the right color profile or the wrong paper, again, we're never going to be able to reproduce the colors that we originally saw when we took the image. So we're going to work through a few of the systems that we can put in place to ensure we get as close as possible. So how do we achieve our aim of everything matching as much as possible? Well, firstly, we need to calibrate the input devices, the camera. Obviously, that's generally done for us. Our displays and output devices. So that output device could be an in-house printing device, or obviously we could be sending the file to a commercial printer to be printed, or even just uploaded to the web. So we can do that various ways. Generally, for an output device, we would have a color profile for a particular printer and ink and paper combination. And normally, if we're sending a file to a commercial printer, they'll specify generally sRGB or Adobe RGB for a color space for you to send them the file in so that you'll get good results when they send you the file back. Obviously, cameras these days have a huge color range that they can actually capture. And depending on the device, it's just not going to be possible to print every single color that we capture. So we need to find a way to basically enable the colors we've got to be managed down into a color set that can be printed by the device. And if we look at the image here, you know, we're all used to working either sRGB, the smaller triangle, or even Adobe RGB in our editing workflows. But obviously, if we were outputting to this particular matte paper, you can see here within that circle, that's the range of tones that that printer with its ink and paper combination can output. So if we've got tones that are in the high greens, reds or blues, we need to find a way of getting those colors mapped back to within this circle so that we can actually have the tones that we asked for, or as close to as possible. So to do that, we need to work through what's called a color space conversion. So just to give you an idea here or a comparison before we start, within Hasselblad's workflow, if you use focus, the default color space, or the, if you like, the range of tones that we can actually work with, here is shown in this light gray outer. So if we look here, Adobe RGB is the color, and we can see that Hasselblad can represent many, many more colors within its color space than is in Adobe RGB. Obviously, sRGB being a smaller color space, obviously there are many tones that are not reproducible from here. And obviously, here's our example from the previous slide of that photo paper. We can see that the range of tones is far smaller than we can work on in the Hasselblad RGB color space. Obviously, there are even wider color gamut color spaces available. Even within focus software, you can have the L star, which is effectively a wide gamut color space. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail as we go along. But if we have this situation where we have colors that are in the gray areas, and we, particularly with a printer, if we want to output those colors, we need a way of then transforming or transitioning those tones into colors that are replacements. So normally, when you make that transformation, you would use a rendering intent. So those that are Photoshop users will know perceptual relative colorimetric type transformations. And effectively what we're trying to do is take colors that are outside the device's color range and map those colors into a color that can be printed or displayed. Two types. Relative colorimetric basically maps a color that's out of gamut to its nearest possible color within the acceptable range for the device. Issue with this is if I have many tones, as you can see here, which are separated in the original color space, they're just mapped to the nearest color, and we could end up with a whole batch of tones that are literally very, very similar when originally there was a big difference. So that's where we use something like perceptual, which instead of just moving the individual tones, actually moves a whole batch of tones together so that the reference between them, or the slight subtle differences between them, remain. And that way, when we compress the colors down, the actual tonal differences between them, we still get that. So that's effectively talking about the output stages, be that a display or be that a printer. Normally, you would have to do large gamut compressions or clippings when you're outputting to, as we saw, maybe a matte paper or a printer ink combination that hasn't got a wide tonal range, a wide color gamut. Sometimes it could be, if we need to compress an image, we all do it all the time when we upload to the web. Generally, we're using sRGB, so we need to compress the color gamut within our raw files, compress it down into colors that can be displayed accurately on the screen. So now going to turn to, if you like, the Hasselblad end of this. We're going to talk about image capture. It's vitally important, obviously, that we capture the best quality image that we can right at the start. That gives us the maximum amount of detail to work with once we get into our editing package. And it's not just obviously the color profile or the sensor, it's the whole system. So looking at this, we need to have high quality lenses that have got obviously very, very high resolving power across the whole frame. So we don't want a sharp center and a soft corner. So we need a very flat image plane. So everything is equally illuminated corner to corner and equally sharp. So obviously the design itself then is going to end up being optimized for the particular focal length, the angle of view, obviously, and the type of design. A mirrorless system lens is going to have a different optical light path design to, say, a lens that sits onto a H system camera, which has the camera body and mirror box in between. Obviously, then moving on, you have the high resolution sensor. So currently we have a 50 and a 100 megapixel offering. And not just resolution, but moving on, you're also going to look at the low noise levels, wide dynamic range, high bit depths, and advanced processing algorithms. So we're going to look at these subsystems in a little bit of depth now as we go through and look at what each of these brings to the final image, and then we'll end up talking about HNCS and how everything gets brought together. So going to do a little bit of a comparison. So looking back at one of our most talked about V-system lenses, the Biogon, a wide angle lens, a particular one I've selected because it was used on the SWC. So again, it's sort of reminiscent of a mirrorless type design. And I'm going to compare that with the equivalent focal length on the X1D sensor size, the 44 by 33 sensor. And we're going to look at the improvements that changes have delivered us to these cameras. So as a start, basically each of these line pairs as a basis for comparing, the closer the two lines are together and the flatter they are across the graph, basically the better the resolution and contrast you'll get across the sensor. So if you like, the 0, point here is right in the middle of the sensor, so you would expect to get your highest image quality in terms of contrast resolution to be right in the middle of the sensor. And then obviously as you go out towards the edge of the sensor, or in this particular case, the edge of the piece of film, you would expect the performance to slightly drop off. Now, the yellow line here I've put in so that you can compare exactly the same amount. So this is the sort of around the 27, 28 millimeter point, and very similar here on the Biogon lens. So effectively it's this section of the graph we're comparing against this section. But I think just looking at that, you can see that with the new lens designs, there's a massive improvement in terms of resolution and contrast right across the whole sensor, and considering we're shooting at a wider aperture as well. Now, that's basically delivered by the by the use of extra low dispersion glass, specialist coatings, and where necessary, spherical elements. And basically that allows us to deliver high resolution, good contrast, right into the corners of the sensor, even with the small size and closeness of the rear element from, say, the 30mm to the X1D sensor. So that's the type of thing that's going on all of the time within our systems. Designs are being updated because obviously being a digital sensor, each of the individual pixels has a small micro lens on the top, and if the light is hitting that micro lens at too steep an angle or too much of an angle, then you can end up causing color cast or losing light level coming into the sensor, into the pixel. So each of these designs is optimized to deliver the light as I won't say parallel, but as close to parallel to all of the pixels across the sensor as possible, which then enables us to have a good signal in each pixel. Okay. So moving on to talk a bit more in depth about sensors in general. I suppose the old adage that bigger is better, even today, is still the same. Obviously, when we were all using film, there was no doubt if you were shooting 6.6, 6.7, 6.9, you were going to get a better result on a piece of negative film or slide than if you were using a very small format. So if we start off, a DSLR or even a micro four thirds, and obviously between the two you would have APS-C. They have really good collecting areas. 36 by 24, you've still got a reasonably large sensor there. But when we compare that to, say, the 50 megapixel sensor, already we're up to 70% more physical sensor area. And then when we move on to our 100 megapixel, again, there's even more physical sensor area for light collection. Again, that dictates that we have lenses that can deliver a large enough image circle to illuminate that sensor, and again, equal amounts of illumination corner to corner, so we get good signal in each of those pixels. But I think you can see, comparing the DSLR with those two particular medium format sensors, just in sheer light collection area, there's a massive difference. But it's not just physically about how many megapixels you can squeeze onto that chip area. How good is the pixel? How sensitive is that pixel? And so when we look through this, again, looking at the 50 megapixel sensor, physically, the 50 megapixel is a 5.3 micron. Our 100 megapixel is a 4.6 micron. But if we compare that with something like the 5DS, we're around about 4.1, and the D850 is around 4.35. So again, the pixels are generally bigger on a medium format sensor, so you have a bigger light collecting area even at a pixel level. Again, though, the pixels themselves, it's not just about having as many as we can. Just looking at these two diagrams, I think you can see that the bigger pixel on the right hand side is able to hold a higher level of charge, in terms of that will then be converted into a physical level within our analog to digital converter when we go through. And so the bigger charge we've got, the more it can swamp the electrical noise itself. So any sensor, when it's switched on, even if you had no light hitting it, there will be a small residual charge. That's the noise level that you can pick up. And as long as our light that's coming in can swamp that electrical noise level, then it's not too much of a problem. But basically the difference between the two, so the electrical noise and the charge, is the signal to noise ratio. Now, that signal to noise ratio that we have basically allows us to, that in conjunction with the bit depth, which we'll talk about later, gives us our dynamic range for the sensor. And that obviously to us is very, very important. And in fact, 100 megapixel can give us up to 15 in 16-bit mode, and the 50 megapixel gives us up to 14. Now, if we were talking about your general SLRs, DSLRs, we're probably talking about 12, 13 stops. But obviously, some of the high-end ones now have got in a similar region, 14, 15 stops of dynamic range. But we can see here, basically, that dynamic range enables us to capture detail in the highlights, capture detail in the shadows without losing it and having them all block up. And we can, if things go wrong, with an exposure, it means we're still able to then recover, maybe burnt out highlights. We can pull detail back in or open up block shadows. And for those that like the HDR type image, you can actually get pretty good images, HDR type images, without having to shoot and stack multiple shots. So now we're going to move on and look a little bit at bit depth. Of all the questions we get asked, this is probably the one that people are interested in more than anything else. Now, bit depth itself, basically, within that sensor, we have an amount of charge in each pixel, and we need to convert that into a level, if you like, a signal level. And depending on the number of bits that we have when we convert the signal, the more, if you like, tonal range we will have. So here you can see if I've got a 1-bit output, basically I can have black or white. As I add bits, we go down, the number of tones we have increases, but also the actual smoothness of the gradient here gets smoother and smoother and smoother until it's like a continuous tone. Now, the 100 megapixel that we use on the H60-100 obviously goes up to 16-bit, and that would give us 65,536 levels that we can chop the signal up into. Now, when we then look at that, on our sensor, each pixel has a color filter over it, a red, green, or blue. And so to get a particular pixel's color, we take the signal and we then effectively multiply 65,536 3 times to get the red, green, blue signal level for that pixel, which will give us then our color tone. And so when we work that out, we end up with this. So a 16-bit color space can have or contain that many colors, or definition of that many colors. So it gives us a much, much wider color palette to select from when we're assigning tones and doing our color transformations later on within the camera. So to give you a little idea, sorry, one thing I forgot to mention there. Obviously, the 100 megapixel is 16-bit. Our 50 megapixel is actually 14-bit sensor. But when we transform and process the image, we actually process that through that signal through a 16-bit analog to digital converter, and then we map that into a 16-bit or a wide gamut color space, which we'll talk about a bit later. And so we don't just fill the 2 spare zeros, because obviously we have to save it as a 16-bit file. We don't just fill the 2 zeros with empty. We actually assign proper color values to get a particular tone. So we'll talk about that when we go on to HNCS. So just for comparison, so color space, color gamut. So color space is the range of tones available that we're working in. So again, when we're working on an image in an editor, it could be Adobe RGB, could be sRGB, and you can see that the actual color space, the range of tones that they're enclosing differs depending on which one. Now, color gamut is basically the range of colors that can be output or captured by a device. So you might be working in Adobe RGB, but your screen may only be able to display this smaller subset. So the gamut would be the actual device's capability. Okay. So combining those two items we've just talked about in terms of bit depth and color gamut, if we start off and we have a low bit depth and we have a very narrow gamut, so a very small range of tones that we can physically use on the device, we end up with this stepped effect. So not enough tones to be smooth because we don't have enough bits to represent it. And you can see we don't have a saturated color here or even a white this end. So it's disappointing. If I go to high bit depth, the situation does improve because we do have that smoother continuous tone style here. But again, because we still have that narrow gamut, we don't have access to saturated colors or all the way down to whites basically. So then going back to low bit depth, but having the wide gamut, we can see here now we have white here and we have a nice saturated, in this case red, but it could be any color. But because of the low bit depth, we still have this step. So finally, combining the two, which is what we just talked about, and exactly what we have within the Hasselblad system. Basically, we have high bit depth, in this case 14 or 16 bits natively from the sensor, and wide gamut. So the color space that we use within the camera and within our system is very, very wide. So we actually end up having very smooth tones here, which will help us when we do our color transformations later. So moving on to sensor calibration and alignment. This one is quite critical to Hasselblad, and there's a big difference between us and other manufacturers, to be honest. So we calibrate every single sensor that gets put into the camera body. It goes on to a test rig and we check it, each individual one, and we look for any dead pixels, hot pixels, and obviously we create a calibration file and a map to remove the influence of that. And more specifically, we ensure that if you were to pick, let's say, a green pixel in the top left corner, and you compared that signal output for a given exposure with a green pixel in the center of the sensor, they should give us the same level of signal out. And basically, we create a calibration that ensures that happens. It also neutralizes out any casts that have been introduced by the system. So obviously we use an IR filter in front of the sensor to give us our infrared and UV cut. That obviously has an effect on the color output, if you like, from the sensor. And so we need to compensate for any little changes that's introduced to the system. And this is particularly the case when new sensors come out. We need to create brand new calibrations and reference files to ensure that, you know, if you had a 50 megapixel CMOS and 100 megapixel CMOS, the color rendition that you would get would be very, very similar. Same situation occurred when we moved to CMOS from CCD. We had to ensure that if you worked on either of those systems, the general color rendition that you would see out of the camera would be very, very similar indeed. Finally, the sensor block actually mounted in the camera, we ensure that each one is adjusted so that when the lens is mounted and the image circle from the lens is projected onto the sensor, that image plane is matched by the plane of the sensor. So that way, each corner in the sensor is as equally sharp and, more importantly, is equally illuminated. So we don't have an offset angled sensor. Obviously, as we autofocus from the sensor, again, a misplaced or misaligned sensor could have issues there as well. The sensor output is then obviously calibrated to deliver a set response. Now, this isn't our test image in the top corner here, but it gives you an idea. Basically, you would use certain objects which you know the tone and you know what it should look like. And so when you capture that and the sensor gives you a result, you should get back out what we're expecting. Now, obviously, that's within the constraints of how Hasselblad transform its color. because it may not be an exact like for like, but we know this particular shade should come out this way in Hasselblad's color space. So Hasselblad color handling. So early on, early 2000s, when Hasselblad was the bringing out the H system and developing the color solutions there, we looked at new algorithms and camera profiles and started talking to our users of what they were expecting. And up until that point, effectively, users were being asked, pick a profile, pick a preset for the type of image that you're trying to shoot. So, you know, are you shooting portraits? Are you shooting products? Is it, you know, or a generic one that's a bit of nothing? Basically, you had to pick a look for your final image and then pull it back during editing to hit what you really wanted it to look like. And it's very difficult if you had mixed subjects. You know, if you selected landscape mode to get the greens looking nice for the trees and rolling hills, and then you put your model into that, which is your primary subject. You had to pick something. So effectively, the users fed back there had to be a better way than that. And so that led us to the Hasselblad natural color solution. So the design brief is we wanted to enable photographers to be able to have a single color setting within the camera, which when they took that image, the resulting capture would, to all intents and purposes, look perceptually correct. So it would look like how the human eye saw it, okay? And that's very different to being color accurate. Generally, if you were to take an exact color accurate image, it would be quite flat and boring. And obviously there has to be some contrast, etc., in the image. But critically, the main anchor point within our color space development and color system development was skin tone reproduction. And that was the central hub, if you like, that the rest of the color space was developed around. Additionally, it shouldn't have excessive contrast or sharpening or oversaturated colors. That's not what we're about, basically. The initial profile itself started off with, you know, how does the human vision system work? What happens when we look at something, you know, in terms of the way we correct for white balance and so on. And your eye automatically adds a bit of contrast, shall we say, to the image that it looks at. Now, that profile was then tested with groups of photographers to say, feedback, what do you think? And over many iterations, basically, their feedback was fed in terms of, are the skin tones correct? The colors of everything else correct? Are we out? And bit by bit, the color profile evolved basically to a point where we had a single profile that worked in the vast majority of situations. I know there are some situations where, you know, you want full control of color, whether you're a reproduction house, a museum, and so on. But that's something that, if we get time, we'll talk about a bit later. But for general photography, I'm talking, you know, landscape, product, fashion, portraits, that sort of thing. We had a single solution, and so much so that you won't find a capture or raw color adjustment within a Hasselblad camera. Basically, it takes place off camera, allows you to tweak later on. The only settings you'll find on camera is if you're shooting JPEGs, and then you can select your color space. Okay. So how does this system work? Well, the calibrated data that comes from the sensor, we apply to that a series of transformations which remap the tones from the capture to the look that we spent many, many months developing. So in terms of mapping skin tones to specific values, mapping greens, reds, etc. up to particular places so that we maximize the use of the color space that we have. And again, with the 16-bit data that's coming off the converter, we have huge amount of subtle tones that we are able to then transform and control, and then obviously remap into this color space. Once those color transformations are actually completed, then we do a little trick that was often used with film, a little S-curve to boost a bit of contrast, but more importantly, it sets, we use the maximum amount of the sensor in terms of the black area to get the black point and the white signal areas for the best white points. So we maximize the use of the number of tones available within the sensor system, within the system. Okay, and obviously that then gives us a nice pleasing image in terms of a nice amount of contrast, but not overly top and not too flat. And then from there, basically, we have now got a file that will give very smooth transitions between tones, but actually from a contrast and sharpness and a saturation point of view, is going to give you an image that looks very, shall we say, film-like, smooth, more analog style transitions. And actually one of the images I've used here, you can see nice skin tones. Well, hopefully that looks like on your screen, but on mine, very nice skin tones. Again, detail in the blacks, highlights are well held, and the skin tones are fine. So then, once those transformations and the contrast optimization is complete, we now have our, if you like, our new sensor data or our updated data for that capture. And that now exists in a should we say, device independent color space. And from here, it's up to you. What you choose from this point onwards, this would be the equivalent of your 3FR or 3F file. And then you're taking this then to your editing package. And so by your selection of your final working space, you actually, from here, work through what final transformations take place. So if you were to choose an sRGB color space, as we saw earlier on, the transformations that you're going to have to make between our very, very wide color space we currently have for the raw down to sRGB means a lot of transformations are going to have to be made to try and get the colors to squeeze down into the sRGB color space. And sure, you will probably lose some of the tonal transitions, the subtle tonal transitions between that. But overall, the image will still have the impact you were trying for at the start. Most of us probably work with maybe Adobe RGB or even ProPhoto if you're working with Lightroom. If you are using Focus, and we hope you are, to actually process your RAWs, by default, when you open it up, it's in Hasselblad RGB. So that's a fairly wide gamut color space, similar to ProPhoto. And as you saw earlier in the slides, considerably bigger than Adobe RGB and sRGB. So this will enable you to work on your images with enough color information so that as you're editing, doing highlight recoveries, shadow recoveries, noise corrections, and so on, those particular corrections, there's enough data there that you can do them without introducing, gradients in your colors or combing style effects. So you can make your alterations without it going, should we say, horribly wrong. For those users that need an even wider gamut, and this would be museums, reproduction houses, there is an L-star, so basically like a lab color style color space. Now that is normally used by them when they are creating their own color profiles, their own calibrations, because they're trying to match across multiple cameras and multiple lighting setups. So they're effectively going to override the built-in profile. But by default, for most of us, we will stick with Hasselblad RGB or probably Adobe RGB or even ProPhoto if you were using an Adobe product. Okay. That then dictates the amount of color transformations that you have. Now, in general, to get the best from your file, we would recommend that you transform to a smaller color space right at the end of your editing journey. So you want to keep it as wide as possible, do your changes, and then transform down to either sRGB if you're output into the web, or obviously if you're sending to your printer, again, you may need to do a CMYK conversion, but again, that's the last thing that happens. So that now takes me on to getting the best from your raw file. Now, obviously, we would recommend, to use Focus. Now, Focus is our raw converter. I mean, there's a huge number of tools in this, and we're not even going to look into that as such. If you are interested, earlier on in the season, we did a Focus 3.5.1 seminar, and that's up on the YouTube channel. So if you're interested in the basic tools and functionality, that gives you a good overview if you want to look at that. But effectively, I'm going to talk very quickly about getting the best from your Hasselblad raw files, and the differences depending on the route that you take. So 3 main options currently: Focus, Adobe Lightroom, and Adobe Photoshop. Now, obviously, the Adobe options are using Camera Raw effectively to convert that raw file into a file to be worked on within the system. There are some big differences to understand basically on this between the two. Some of them are quite subtle. Other ones, might dictate a change of workflow from you. So, little one first. So, lens corrections. Within Focus, we have a dynamic correction. By that, I mean, if I'm using a particular lens, the lens correction will modify itself depending on the focus distance and also the aperture in use. If I have a zoom, it will modify itself even based on the focal length in use. Whereas unfortunately, if you go to the Adobe products, it will literally give you one correction. So again, depending on the type of lens in use, if you're using maybe a super wide lens or a zoom, again, a few benefits there for using the Focus workflow. Profiling. Adobe does not use or does not read the color information from a Hasselblad raw file. It has its own calibration built in. So as soon as it sees this is a Hasselblad 3F or even 3FR, it will say, here's your Hasselblad, or here's a profile to use with your Hasselblad file. Now, that's going to be good and maybe good enough, but to get the best out of the file and the best out of all of the color control and transformations that we have just done, you would be better off doing your raw conversion in Focus. Additionally, now, with the latest version 3 algorithms in the exposure tool in Focus 3.5, you can now extract far more detail from burnt out highlights, blocked up shadows. You can reintroduce the detail there, control detail in the clarity type slider. You can extract a huge amount more data than previous versions without any graying as you bring in the effect. Additionally, the noise reduction, the noise control is best managed within Focus software. So this is especially true of long exposure, high ISOs type images where the noise builds up, especially at the very high ISOs. The reduction that's put in place by Focus is very, very good. And that's not to say that the Adobe product isn't good. It's just for the worst case scenario, Focus would allow you to extract that little bit more information without having the noise level, as it were, within the file. So again, depends on your workflow and how extreme your image is as to what's going to work best for you. Now, I think for most people, getting to a 16-bit TIFF is probably the best case scenario. And for me, I would say in this case, import your raw into Focus 3.5, process it to get the maximum information you can from that file. Use that exposure tool to really maximize the amount of detail in the shadows, keep the detail in the highlights, apply the noise reduction routines, and then export that out as a 16-bit TIFF. You've got the best you can for the file. Now, for any finishing and final retouching, etc., then you can use your Photoshop or Lightroom tools or plugins if that's what you want to use to then finalize the image from there. Unfortunately, those particular corrections that you do in Focus currently aren't read by Adobe. So if you don't want to use Focus as your converter, then you'll have to feed into Adobe for the conversion and then work through there. But it depends on your current workflow. So that's pretty much an overview, if you like, of where we are color processing through Hasselblad system and what we've tried to achieve with the natural color solution. In a nutshell, we've delivered to the photographer a single color choice. So you don't have to think about what you're trying to capture and what color it should be. Ignore that. Shoot with the camera, and then basically we end up with a final color transformed image that we can work on that gives us the maximum amount of information out of our system. And that's it for me. Questions now, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yeah, got quite a few questions. So first of all, from Alex, he's asking about the transition we made from CCD sensors to CMOS sensors. So did we have to do some changes to how our colors worked during that change?
Yeah, because obviously, the actual sensors themselves are fundamentally different in terms of the way the data is read out and so on. But in terms of, there's different filter set obviously on top of the pixels compared to the CCD, and so you have to make that transition just in sheer terms of the color response of the actual differences in the sensor. So if I was to take a picture of a red, green, blue image, that would give me a certain result from the CCD, and I'd need to apply a correction. If I took the same picture with the same exposure settings on the CMOS, the two sensors would be different in their default response. And so basically we have to create a calibration that compensates so they match.
Okay, that's great. And then Alex with another question. So with the X1D 50 and the 860 100, would you see any differences in colors between those two sensors?
Where you possibly would see a difference if you were working right on an extreme color of a 16-bit color space, let's put it that way. So really, really subtle tone. And again, this is something you would see if you were in a reproduction house or a museum where you're trying to find an exact match to a particular pigment. But in general, everyday photography where we don't have a specific spot color we're trying to reproduce, generally no, you would really have to pixel peep to look.
Okay. Question from Gregory, relative colorimetric against perceptual. When would each of those be used?
So normally it comes down to the range of colors and the type of subject you're trying to reproduce. If it's a general photographic subject where you've got a mix, and by this I mean your general outdoor type photography, you would probably use perceptual there because you want everything to stay, the relationships between the colors. So imagine we've got a sunset over a lovely rolling hillside with the green grass and so on. If we want to compress the colors down, what we need to do is keep that link between all of the tones, which is what we're liking as a human looking at it. Perceptual would be used to then manage down the actual massive range, but the link between them still stays. Whereas if we're actually doing a product or more of a technical copy, we can get away with just bringing all of the sort of greens and reds to a certain point. We don't really need that subtle shade transition. Actually, okay. The way that Hasselblad does its transformations is I can't go into too much detail, but it's a subtle mix of both.
Okay. A question from Murray. What happens when you convert to CMYK? What's the process for that?
Yeah, again, that's normally done by generally you'll have a RIP device that would then feed a CMYK printer. So the transformation there, you would send RGB data to the RIP device or piece of software, which then does that transformation into CMYK. And again, what it's doing there, it's taking the color set that you've got within your image and saying, okay, I'm going to remap. And again, this is where the rendering intent comes in. It then breaks those out into combinations of the relevant color. And again, this depends on how many inks you've got on the printer and so on that you're going to use. So that's generally done by a separate driver, if you like.
Okay. And a question from Menno, was there a particular film that we used as a reference for HNCS?
No, I would say probably along the sort of Kodak style, you know, the portraits and so on. Think of your portrait films that you like to use with, should we say, a more subtle skin tone, not overpowered. So we were looking for that subtle, pleasing look. You know, we didn't want to end up everybody looking suntanned, etc. You know, we want a nice, pleasing look to skin tones, but in a more analog feel. But I don't think there was a specific film that we were looking at. It was more a range of, okay, these photographers were shooting portraits, fashion, etc. What do you think? And the feedback came in terms of, you know, it's too warm, too cold, etc. And then those modifications were made to end up with a sort of a real hybrid of what was required that suited pretty much everything.
Okay. A question from Jim. What file format do you recommend for exporting from Focus for use in other software?
So obviously within Focus, you have the option for DNG, you have the option for 16-bit TIFF, JPEG, PSD, and so on. Now, personally, when I work within Focus, I do my whole raw workflow in Focus so I get to a finished file. Generally, then I'll export it as a 16-bit TIFF. So I've done the hard work, if you like. Then I take the 16-bit TIFF and I put that into Photoshop for final tweaking and maybe any cloning, etc., that maybe need to be done. If you export as a DNG, the issue is you've imported and done the transformation for lens corrections, noise reduction, etc. But anything else that you do to the file, when you export it as a DNG, nothing reads it. So it will be as if you're opening a blank, untouched raw file. So I can understand that you want to get a DNG to feed into a different editing software, but actually you may as well take the 3FR or 3F file and put it straight into Lightroom and work through that way. But personally, I would create the 3FR file, so import it, and then work on that if I was in Camera Raw or Lightroom.
Great. Question from Stockton. So the HNCS profile, do you have to select it within Focus or is it applied as standard?
That is our default color workflow. So from the camera through to the file that you're working on in Focus when you first open, it's in the background, it's doing the transformations. When you open the file in Focus, that transformation's done, HNCS is applied, and then you choose the working space you're going to view it in. The same would happen if you opened the file elsewhere. By choosing your default workspace, sRGB, Adobe RGB, you then determine how the file is transformed for you to work on it.
Okay. And then, so there's 3 Hasselblad profiles in Photoshop, according to Hector. The Hasselblad L-Star RGB, Hasselblad REC 709, and the Hasselblad RGB. What is the best for the X1D2?
So if you're going to be in general editing, Hasselblad RGB, because that's the same as working in Focus, so you've got the maximum amount of information possible. If you were going to create your own profiles and had actually been working in reproduction mode in Focus, and so you had a real sort of a linear response, very flat image, then you could use the L-Star RGB, because that will enable you to then have literally no effect on the image, put it out to the profiling system and create a profile to put into the camera. The other one is actually film or scanner side of things, so we don't touch that. It's just the two L-Star or Hasselblad RGB. 99% of the time, Hasselblad RGB.
Okay. Just have a look at some of the questions that are coming in. How often does a camera need calibrating during its lifetime? That's a question from Marcel.
The actual sensor itself, the calibration file that we create, should never need to be updated.
Okay.
There was a should in there. Obviously, you know, it's an electrical device. If something was to happen and you got, you know, a dead pixel or something 2 years, 5 years down the line, whatever, then sure, you know, it could be returned and it could have a new calibration file created to compensate for that. But there is only so much you can obviously do. But generally, you wouldn't need to have that recalibrated.
Okay, and then final question from Carlos. So he's asking about transforming to black and white images. So does the HNCS also insist in that?
Yeah, so again, in the background, basically, HNCS will do all of its normal transformations. And then once you're within, let's, as an example, take focus. So I'm working in focus, I'm working with Hasselblad RGB. When I tick the grayscale, at that point, basically what I can do is tweak the RGB levels within the image to give me the effect of changing the contrast and the response of my black and white within the image. And again, that's just a case of tweaking and adjusting to your own preferred level, but effectively you're still working on an RGB image at the background. And then when you come to export as a grayscale, then the transformation to effectively gray shades is made for the export of the file.
Okay, great. So that's pretty much the end of today's session. Thank you very much, Chris.
No problem.
So just to wrap up here, another quick reminder of our webinar next Thursday, the virtual medium format meetup with Chris Gunn, and not forgetting the firmware update one on Tuesday as well to cover the new features that we brought out in today's firmware update. And as always, if you want any more information on Hasselblad, our website at hasselblad.com has everything on it that you should need in terms of products, details on our partner network, inspirational stories, elements on our history. You can request a demo and more information, and customer support as well. So thank you very much for tuning in. This will be available on YouTube as a recording within the next few hours. So check back there and have another look if you want to have a look again. And we hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.